Friends, welcome to another Transforming Chaplaincy webinar. My name is Paul Galeshoot. I get to serve as the Assistant Director of Engagement, and I'm going to share my screen here so that we can get some introductions done here. And I'm going to pull that up. We're so glad that you're a part of this, no matter where you're coming from, especially during this holiday time. My sweater was very intentional for that purpose because it's going to be -6 here in Minnesota tonight. So this sweater is for sure seeking to convey that. But the warmth isn't going to come from me. It's going to thankfully come from the experts that are here today for this event, featuring this paper that I'll drop in the chat here very soon. It's about the scoping review, chaplain care for healthcare colleagues. This is, again, who I am. I get to serve in this role and get to be a part of these webinars. We'd love to have you be a part of us in general. This is very intentional. Things do slide around here in Minnesota at this time of year. If you're not familiar with what this sport is, it's curling. That is a rock, and they play that around here. We have our research networks. It's a community platform that we'd love to have you be a part of. It's completely free. There's 9 spaces in there. Some of them, one's dedicated, for example, to hospice and palliative care or serious illness. One's on mental illness or healthcare in that space. So if you are interested in that, you're brand new, you've never been a part of one of our webinars before, we'd love to have you be a part of that and contribute your expertise. We do things like post events or the latest evidence-based research that comes out in that specific space. So thanks for your consideration there. We'd love to have you join us again next week on Monday on a social media post. I don't think you can talk about spiritual care and palliative care without saying the name Dr. Betty Farrell. She is the person on your left, and she'll be joined as a discussant with the person on the right, a friend to Transforming Chaplaincy, Danielle Gilchrist, a palliative care chaplain and researcher and a PhD student along with me at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. So there's a QR code in case you want to join us for that. Again, all these webinars are posted to our Transforming Chaplaincy YouTube channel. We'd love to have you find us there. But for today, we are so glad to have with us experts. The first author on this paper and the work related to it is Sarah Knapp. Sarah is a certified educator within the ACPE and a faculty member and currently supervising chaplain residents. We sometimes use this phrase, Sarah, that working with chaplains is like herding cats. So I'd love to hear what that's like when you educate chaplain residents. That's another webinar down the road. In addition to being an educator, you're also a board certified chaplain and an ordained elder at the United Methodist Church. And as we talked about before the webinar, go Hoosiers. Ben Schaefer, I've been a chaplain in various settings for about 19 years. That's about how long I've been in this game. He's the manager of spiritual care with Ascension, Michigan, and he is the convener within our Transforming Chaplaincy Spiritual Care Management Network. It's one of those networks that I mentioned earlier. In his free time, Ben, we try not to be fraudulent or deceitful in this free time. Who are you kidding me? But when you can, he explores nature with his family. I think you're a forester by background, if I remember right, and woodworking and photography. So these are our presenters and the experts that are on this paper. In addition to their expertise, Dr. George Fichette, co-founder of Transforming Chaplaincy and our senior advisor, is also the senior author on this paper. Joining us at the end of this webinar today is Dr. Rachel Thienprayoon. This is a very minimal introduction, but if you want to find out more, drop her name into Google. She is the Chief Clinical Wellness Officer at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where she's also a pediatric hospice and palliative care physician. I get to join her in this world of the Cambia Sojourn Scholar. And please, if you are going to Google Rachel, drop in organizational compassion, especially if you're going to PubMed, some important work done by her in that space. So friends, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn this over to my friend, Ben, and I'm going to step out. Look forward to seeing you at the end. Thank you very much, Sarah, Ben, and Rachel, for your expertise and what you bring to us and our friends for the next hour.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here with us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are. We're excited to have this opportunity to talk a little bit more about this paper and really where care for healthcare colleagues is going and what we can do as chaplains to be more and more engaged in building a culture throughout all of our health systems to really support and encourage good care of our fellow colleagues. Some of our objectives for today is to understand what the research shows chaplains are currently doing to care for healthcare colleagues. We get this question often within TC of what are people doing out there? What is actually happening already that I could learn from, engage from, and build out in my own setting? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what the research out there shows. We hope at the end of this you'll be able to discuss a little bit more of the areas that chaplains can impact healthcare wellness. If we think about the ways that we can better support and promote wellness for our colleagues, there are special ways that chaplains can really plug in and help build that into the culture of where you work. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And we also hope that you're able to describe some of the gaps and the needs for further research. As much as we read and explored working on this paper, we found there are so many places where there just isn't enough research. And we encourage you to be thinking about that and ways that you can engage that as you're looking for ways to build out caring for other HCPs in your settings.
As Paul mentioned, I'm a CPE educator, so I'd like to welcome any students who might be on the webinar as well as you're learning about best practices. But I'd also like to invite the chaplains to take a moment to think back to your CPE training. Maybe recall chaplain mentors or preceptors who did an especially good job of connecting with doctors, nurses, and other healthcare colleagues. Hope you have someone in mind who just did a really great job. Maybe someone who stepped up at a critical moment or in a difficult situation. Maybe a chaplain who was just there day to day doing a million small things, and you could see how the staff gravitated toward them or sought them out. If we could capture all these experiences from multiple perspectives, then we would have a library of interventions to share with each other. It's one of the benefits of training of your CPE units is you got to see chaplains doing this good work. If we could capture all of that, we could discern some best practices. And when we talk about what are best practices, we're thinking about variables and looking at the outcomes when we vary those things. And we also try to see if the outcomes are achievable in other settings. This would give us an indicator of a best practice. So our literature review wanted to look for the interventions that chaplains are already doing. So we could maybe point to those to learn from them, but also to share with leaders and others who could benefit, how chaplains can benefit supporting healthcare workers. This is a brief history of our review. Our first paper with a few other authors was published in the Journal of Healthcare Management. And we used the National Academy of Medicine model to categorize factors related to clinician stress and resilience. We selected that model because it was developed as a result of a rigorous process by a panel of experts. The model focused on well-being and resilience, with well-being defined as a state of personal fulfillment and engagement that leads to joy in practice and ultimately a connection to why you go into healthcare in the first place. The NAM model also included both internal and external factors, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And the NAM model also included clinicians across multiple disciplines because, as they acknowledged, clinical outcomes are affected by all members of the interprofessional team, and the well-being of all members is important. After exploring these factors, we found in that first paper that the top 4 factors contributing to clinician distress are organizational factors, learning practice environment, and healthcare responsibilities. And 2 of the top 4 factors contributing to resilience are organizational factors and learning practice environment. So those became very important, kind of rose to the top. So in February of 2022, we began a literature search to see what chaplains were doing to address those factors related to stress and resilience. So there are many conceptual models for workplace well-being and related elements. And some related elements to well-being that you might have heard of are burnout, engagement, or resilience. A common theme across these models is that well-being is a function of the relationship between demands and resources. So we want to look at how we deploy resources to meet different demands. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, most models reference both individual or internal resources or demands, and then as well as external or environmental and organizational resources and demands. On this slide, the yellow ones are those external, organizational or environmental factors, and the blue wedges represent the internal personal factors or skills and abilities. The research suggests that external factors carry more weight in contributing to burnout. So focusing on the individual, if we were to focus on the individual only, that would suggest that burnout is the outcome of a person unable to adapt to the learning and practice environment, which is just not the whole picture. And historically, chaplains have tended to focus on one-on-one interventions that might address those factors, like one way to enhance someone's skills and abilities might be to teach them mindfulness or stress relievers related to spirituality. Another way to address a personal factor might be connecting to individuals in their personal spiritual practices like prayer or reflection. Both of those things can be important, but if we focus on them exclusively, we're missing a big chunk of the pie. One framework for burnout indicates it's paradoxical that most interventions to alleviate burnout focus on individuals, since the research suggests that situational and organizational factors play a bigger role. So we wondered, do chaplains provide care that addresses organizational factors, and what does that look like?
So as we worked through doing this literature review and reading all of these articles, narrowing it down to the ones that really applied to our care for HCPs and the way that we can connect and provide that care, we came up with these kind of 4 emerging themes that were most significant and carried through most of the literature out there, exemplifying where we can and do focus our energy already. So the first of these themes was articles that describe direct care programs that were led by chaplains. So these are programs that are organized, run through a spiritual care department or an individual chaplain that they have kind of full oversight of and are working through providing that care to other HCPs. The second theme that we saw in the literature were articles that describe direct care being done by chaplains, but it's a part of a larger program or a larger intervention of the organization. So these might be things like Code Lavender or Chai Carts or all these Tea for the Soul, things like that that are meant to be a little bit more interdisciplinary, processing situations, working through what's going on. And those categories were much more interdisciplinary in the way that they worked. Our third theme that we came across here was articles that show indirect effects of chaplain care. It becomes almost a vicarious care of healthcare workers, HCPs, when we think about the care that we're providing to patients and their loved ones, and the way that takes stress off of the other HCPs. It gives us a sense of the ways we can really engage with and support them by removing that anxiety, that stress, of providing good care to those patients and their loved ones in ways that help the HCP's other disciplines focus in on the work that they need to do, and really engage the whole system for providing that interdisciplinary care for those patients. And then the fourth category that we came across here were articles that were addressing these other themes, not necessarily connected with these first 3, but were really tied into what has happened through COVID and as we've kind of come through to the new reality of where we work. There were a number of articles that kind of touched on the experience of providing care to associates and to fellow colleagues as they were going through COVID and dealing with the crises and the catastrophes that they were dealing with. And seeing how chaplains really engaged and embedded that. We've all seen the news articles and things around where chaplains really stepped into a new light in that way. And there's some other research that's going along and coming out more and more each day that really connected to that as well as we went through this.
So we found, focused on 59 articles published between 1992 and 2022 and discerned 5 major themes, as Ben mentioned. And this table describes how we showed that 16 of the articles report on the effects of chaplain care for staff. All 16 articles described effects on learning and practice environment, which, if you remember, is one of those external or yellow factors. And 2 of the articles described organizational factors. Only 4 described interventions that could be categorized as impacting skills and abilities, which were some of those internal or blue factors. And only 1 article we found described an intervention impacting personal factors, which were also internal factors or in the blue wedge of the pie. So one of the articles we just chose to highlight from those describes the indirect effects when chaplains care for patients and families. It benefits the staff colleagues. This was a pretty large national sample of 475 pediatric critical care fellows and attending physicians. That was a response rate of 36.7%. And the big takeaway is that chaplain involvement in delivering bad news was associated with statistically significantly higher scores for compassion satisfaction. And high compassion satisfaction is associated with lower rates of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is a sign of burnout. Compassion satisfaction can be defined as emotional fulfillment derived from providing care to others. So this kind of calls back to the earlier slide about why we're attracted to healthcare and do healthcare. So thinking about the providers in your clinical areas, you might think about what makes that area particularly challenging, and related to that, what makes the work meaningful? Because if you have opportunities to have those conversations with colleagues, it could give them a chance to connect to their compassion satisfaction. We also looked at direct and indirect effects of chaplain care. This was one chaplain providing interventions over 5 years to address stress in ICU and nursing staff. It was a survey, so 80 nurses completed the survey, which is 41%, pretty good response rate. They noticed that spiritual well-being was high when the stress and intent to leave were low. However, there was no significant connection between spirituality and stress or the intent to stay. So this is one example of where we could do more research because there was no data collected before implementation of the initiatives. Also, we don't know which intervention had what impact because the initiatives were not initiated as independent variables. This article described how an experienced embedded chaplain makes a difference and highlighted that direct and indirect effects of chaplain care are especially evident in units where there are complex medical decisions happening, like ICUs, palliative care, and other end-of-life care. So this was another group of nurses, mostly nurses, 47 PICU staff, who were offered a resiliency bundle. And the bundle included structured debriefings with chaplains. Interestingly, nearly half the sample opted to debrief with a chaplain, so they knew about chaplains and sought out their care. In using a pre-test and a post-test, they discovered that the resiliency bundle implementation was associated with a statistically significant increase in the group's resiliency score.
So these were kind of the examples that we look at of how chaplains are engaged in providing that care in the direct and indirect ways. The other piece that we looked at in this study was staff aware of chaplaincy and how did they utilize the chaplain in the care that they were receiving for themselves or in providing to others. And so we were able to find these 7 articles that dug into this a little bit more, showed how chaplaincy cared for, or they were at least aware of chaplains or utilized chaplains. And so just a couple of these to highlight that point to both the strengths as well as the areas for growth for chaplaincy. This was an interesting study that rather than asking people who are on the front lines, providing the care, working alongside the chaplains, they went and talked to the healthcare administrators and asked them, what is your perception of chaplaincy and spiritual care? How do you see what the chaplains are doing? Where do you see them valued? What's important for them to be doing in the hospital? And so they sent this survey out to 494 administrators. And when they got back the results, care staff scored lower than care for patients or families. That doesn't seem to be so much of a surprise that the idea of caring for patients and families or their loved ones was paramount in their minds. But what's interesting is that when you looked at it, of this list of 11 things that they rank of chaplains that they do, providing emotional support to staff or colleagues was tied at number 6. And so that puts it a little bit past halfway down the list. So when you think about those concepts of what chaplains are doing and the perception of administrators, this is not forefront of their mind, that we're providing care and impacting the overall quality of our fellow associates in the work that we do. And so that really raised up this importance of being aware of the care that we do and also helping people understand those places that are beyond just caring for patients or their loved ones. Another article that we were looking at in this category was around moral distress of nurses. So this was a survey of 100 nurses in one health system. So it's a smaller study, limited in scope and location. But they asked open-ended questions about resources that nurses used when they were encountering a morally distressing event. So 61 of them responded to that question, and of them, 20% reference talking to a chaplain. So a pretty small proportion are saying, when I have a morally distressing event, the people I'm talking to, one of them is my chaplain. So in fact, when they were asked to rank them, then talking to the chaplain was the 3rd most frequently mentioned choice. So the first one was talking to their nurse manager, and the second was talking to a member of the ethics committee. So again, this is another opportunity for us to look at the ways that we're addressing moral distress and engaging our connection with those around us in ways that help mitigate and support those in moral distress. So as we summarize these findings and look at what we learned and what we're able to show in this paper, we went back to the NAM model. And this idea that learning and practice environments and the organizational factors have really big associations, both with clinician stress and resilience. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but the idea that we target the personal or internal factors to the detriment of the external factors is a place that we have a lot of opportunity to grow, develop, and engage when we think about how we do our chaplain work. We have so much opportunity with these external factors that have so seldom been a central part of what we do. It's where we can really impact what the literature is showing us. It's the need is there. So when we found, looking through this review, is that 16 of the articles are describing effects that are in the external factor of learning and practice environments. And then 2 of them were also in the organizational factors, so both in those external ones. And as Sarah mentioned before, only 5 of them were in that category of personal or internal things. So when we keep our chaplain interventions connected to the organization, to the culture, to the systems that are in place, we have this really great opportunity to build into caring for our fellow associates in a way that helps them within the culture of the organization, rather than minimizing what someone's going through and saying, you just need to work on that personal. Maybe if you do some more yoga at home, that'll do it. But the research is really showing that that is not what the issue is. It's not a moral failing on someone's part, or it's that they're not trying something hard enough at home. But we have this opportunity to build it into the culture where we're promoting resilience, where we're helping people within the culture of the system, that's a culture that supports and sustains our fellow associates in a way that helps them thrive, rather than putting the impotence on them to do these things internally. So a few more implications for those of you who may be spiritual care leaders or having some impact and connection with other leaders in your organizations. These are some of those kind of key points that we hope you take away and think about the ways that you can engage and direct this growth of associate care in your organizations. So when chaplains are caring for patients and their loved ones, it does benefit their healthcare colleagues. The literature shows that indirect care helps them feel less stressed, more resilient, less burnt out. And it becomes a vicarious care of our colleagues by caring for those patients and their loved ones. The direct and indirect effects are work. Like if you're looking at the most bang for your buck of where to target that work in ways that help both care for the patients and the associates, it's in those complex situations, whether that be palliative care, end of life care, ICUs, EDs. There are many of these places where there's complex, lots of different decisions being made, conversations are happening with families. There's a lot of uncertainty and distress about what's going to happen with us in the coming minutes, if not days. That's the place where the literature really shows that we can target and have the most effect both on the patients, loved ones, and our fellow associates. And then another one here is this one, I feel like it has more caveats than I would like, that if we have an experienced chaplain who is able to be well integrated into the clinical team, they have a huge opportunity to build programs that contribute to the staff support. So if you're able to be integrated, have that experience, engage your team in a way that helps them understand and see the value of spiritual care, it really does help build that staff support within the culture of the organization as a whole. And it also gives the opportunity to be able to support staff when they're working with those difficult and distressing cases. We looked back at that one survey that said, 20% of them named the chaplain as someone they would go to. When you're embedded, when you're connected with that team, have that trust, have that sense of community and engagement, you're able to do that in a way that supports those distressed associates dealing with those complex cases. And when you're looking ahead to what you're doing within your organization, again, focusing interventions on those external factors, the organizational factors that are listed in the NAM model. If you're able to really focus in on those yellow ones, we'll pull that up here in a minute again to look at, but that gives us the opportunity to affect the ways that have the biggest impact on our associates and the ways that they're dealing with what's going on. So here you can see that again in the image of, we had those 18 articles that are all the external factors, and we had the 5 that they were the personal or internal factors. So if you take one thing away from this, I hope it is that you find new ways to engage those external factors, that you can become more embedded in ways of helping the culture change, the engagement within the community of where you work, in ways that change those, while also letting people focus on the personal things that are important to them, that help them find meaning and value in their work. Those are important. But when they're being pushed down and subjugated by the culture around them and the ways of what they're working and doing, there's a big chance that they won't do what we hope for those interventions. So, tea for the soul is a great thing, and it cares for people with the within those personal and internal factors. But unless their culture on their floors or their units give them the opportunity to take that step away, where they have mutual support from their colleagues to take a deep breath and to get that tea or essential oil or whatever it may be, we're not actually helping them cope within the whole system. We're just helping them take a deep breath rather than build that change into what they're doing.
So as Ben mentioned earlier, we definitely need more research. Some of the limitations that we've noticed just in doing this article are in reading this research is that we need quantitative studies that assess the effects on important outcomes. So we didn't have as many quantitative studies as we would have liked. We would like to evaluate the role chaplains can have in aligning organizational and individual healthcare worker values. That's that compassion, satisfaction, why we do what we do, is related to that. We would like to study both direct effects and indirect effects of chaplain care, using larger sample sizes for greater generalizability would be good, and definitely need greater diversity in study samples. Most of our articles we read were focused on nurses, quite a lot on physicians too. But we could have other healthcare workers, colleagues included. We needed more diverse clinical settings as well, including mostly we looked at intensive care, or most of the articles looked at intensive care, palliative care, and other settings, and then multi-institutional studies as well.
So we're now going to take the opportunity to have a response to this, continue to dig more deeply into the research and things. I've been looking through the comments as we've been going, and it's exciting to just see the conversation going back and forth, and hopefully we'll be able to engage and have a little bit more conversation about this. And so I'm going to stop sharing so we can have a little bit more conversation with our screens here.
And I'm happy to chime in a little bit too. Thank you guys so much for this and for this paper. I published a scoping review a couple of years ago, and when I asked for advice from friends as we were preparing for it, they said, don't do it. It's going to take you years. It's such hard work. So congratulations getting it done and getting it published. It is an immense amount of work to publish a scoping review, and so much more painful than you can ever appreciate until you've done it. So much was rising up for me as you guys were talking, and in looking at the chat too. So I was going to just share a couple of thoughts that sort of rose up for me, just like thinking about this paper. And as you were talking, I think that the question we're trying to answer is, what is the impact of chaplains on clinician well-being or workforce well-being? And as a chief wellness officer, maybe it's because I'm a palliative care doctor. Maybe it's because I've been a chaplain groupie for a long time, even since before I did my palliative care fellowship. But it was impossible for me to imagine the wellness program at Cincinnati Children's without having a strong relationship with our spiritual care team. If I could just like summarize like the goal of my job in one sentence. I think it's simply to inject humanity into our system and into how we care for our workforce. And so the phrase that we use in our strategic plan is to create healing architecture. And even as I was like reading the questions in the chat and going into the NAM model again, which I've reflected on multiple times this year, you know, I have this hung up next to my desk and it's got some notes on it. So just ignore those, but it's like a trauma-informed organization. And we're trying to create this over here, a healing organization. And the elements of that are integrated, reflective, relationship-centered, all the things that chaplains in our spiritual care team bring into Cincinnati Children's every day. You know, when I write and talk about organizational compassion, one of the things that I say is, I worry that medicine over the past decades has dehumanized clinicians in our training in service of patient care, and that the American healthcare system as currently structured dehumanizes patients. And so there's inherent suffering into being a patient, then there's also avoidable suffering that the system layers into it. And that causes suffering for our clinicians. And who is adept at and trained to hold that suffering for us? It's our chaplains who can actually sit with that suffering and acknowledge it and begin to like recenter our humanity just as human beings who are caring for people who are suffering. I really appreciated the Gibbons paper as well. Gibbon paper. I love that you called that out. You say in your scoping review, we speculate that the chaplain may provide a unique layer of emotional and spiritual support to the pediatric critical care provider, as well as to patients and families. And that leads to higher compassion satisfaction. And in the second paper noted in that section, it also leads to higher patient satisfaction scores. My hypothesis is simply that when we are allowed to attend to our patient's suffering, perhaps mediated by the chaplain's presence or supported by the chaplain's presence, that actually enhances our identities as healers and as people who are there to attend to patient suffering. I was asked by Matt Norvell, I don't see him on, I think he was thinking of attending, but he's a good chaplain friend. When I was talking about organizational compassion months ago in another chaplain webinar, what is organizational suffering? And I was like, how have I never been asked that question before? I come back to organizational grief over and over and over. And I think, again, clinicians carry so much grief, and these areas of high medical complexity or medical decision-making that you highlight are also just areas of high suffering for patients and for clinicians, right? And that creates grief. And who are the people who hold the grief and help us walk through our own grief? It's our spiritual care staff. So Brian Wright is on the call. He leads bereavement support for Cincinnati Children's. And again, like all of this, when I think you ask about organizational factors, organizational culture, how do we craft a culture that really centers the humanity of our clinicians? It is in a tight relationship with our chaplains. So I can shut up for a second and say more. People can ask like more questions, or I can just like keep opining, which is kind of annoying.
Rachel, I appreciate
Go ahead.
so much of what you said, but you just put words to what I've heard so many physician colleagues and physician residents say, is like they get in the work because they are empathic people, and they are at risk whenever it's they are being dehumanized, so that they kind of have to disregard some of these things that they want to do. So when we can provide that space for them to just be the empathetic, caring people they are, then that connects to the compassion satisfaction for sure. It's not the hard work. The work is hard. They know the work is hard when they come to it. It's that they can still be the whole person doing hard work that keeps them whole.
Yeah. And I was thinking, it's funny how events cluster. The paper that I dropped in the chat about spiritual suffering was just sent to me today by one of our chaplains, Salvador, wondering about whether we should replicate that study or think about the impact of that study. I wonder about the relationship between spiritual distress and moral distress. And so it was like doing a quick lit search while you guys were talking, and there's a clear relationship between moral distress and spiritual distress. So I wonder if maybe medicine in a very rational way has tried to create a very logical framework for what is actually spiritual distress. We prefer to call it moral distress because we have a whole ethics framework around that, right? But it's maybe spiritual suffering that our people are also experiencing as they experience moral distress. And so more about organizational grief and suffering. Yeah, right. Everybody grieves. I think clinicians are grieving, God, multiple things at any given time. We're grieving what we thought our careers might look like in relation to the reality of practicing medicine at this moment in time in America. We grieve the suffering of our patients. We're grieving our own human experience. We are human beings in a human space, right? And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot since I've been in the leadership role at Children's is team members die. How does the organization wrap around a team when an employee dies? This happens 20 or 30 times a year. We have 20,000 employees. How do we wrap around that team and acknowledge their grief in a way that's useful? How do we think about our bereavement policy? For when I lose someone I love, 3 days is absurd. We're not done grieving in 3 days. And that's what, I don't know, the capitalist society has decided is an appropriate amount of time to be off. It's all of that. That's all like what rises up when I think about organizational grief. In addition to just like salient events in society, there are wars, major wars happening in areas of our culture right now. There are culture wars happening in America. We're grieving so many things at a given time. And how we integrate our chaplains, what is their role in that versus our EAP? How do we do both well at the same time? How is it both and? Is something that we're constantly talking about and trying to evolve here.
I noticed this question from Jeff about, does anyone have a study about the organizational industrial psychology? I have not seen anything out there on that. I would recommend as a starting point, if you look at the charts within this paper, the tables, I think 2, 3, 4, right there, it has a really nice layout of the summaries of all of these articles. And you might find something there as a thread to kind of pull on to go into some more articles. But I think that there's a real opportunity there to think about what is that organizational culture, especially if we think about this in the sense of grief and organizational grief. How are we building those together in a way that really helps work toward healing rather than pausing and kind of ignoring what's going on and just pushing through?
We found that one article, I think this is in table 2, by McClellan and Vogus, that saw that when a hospital explicitly rewards compassionate acts by its staff and supports its staff during tough times, it's associated with patients more highly rating the care experience and being more likely to recommend the hospital. That was McClellan and Vogus. And that looked at HCAP scores.
Yeah,
so I'm not sure if the question.
Linda
Yeah.
was asking, and I scrolled back up to see your question. What happens when the wellness officer does not have that background and chaplains are limited by the system in communicating with those officers? It's incredibly frustrating and incredibly hard. And even here with my background and with these relationships, as I ask for roles, they're not always filled. And so part of my job has to be quantifying the amount of what with our, spiritual care leaders, quantifying that 20% of our chaplains' time is spent in staff care and figuring out how to quantify the impact of that on retention and turnover and ROI, the ROI of that. And there is an ROI, but making that connection can be really hard. So I don't know. I think it's up to people like me to study it and publish it to try to help everybody else beat that drum back where they are too.
Appreciated this question about, what are we healing? Is it individual? How do we impact the culture? I would say yes, it's all of the above. If we're not healing, promoting healing and wellness for each individual, we're not doing our job well. But if we're not impacting the culture, we're also not doing our job well. It's a little dated definition now, but the World Health Organization's definition of health is a complete balance of physical, mental, emotional well-being for each person. I can say honestly, I've never been a healthy a day in my life by that definition, but that is what we're working toward. And spirituality is a part of that to promote that health. And if we're doing that holistically, we have the opportunity to really move health forward in a healing way for each individual and within the culture.
I think Angelica's question is really interesting. What that, I definitely think we should look to those other, we should compare ourselves with those other supporters. And I kind of go back to the article that says that half the people did seek out chaplains as part of that bundle. So I don't know, if it's just the US kind of population of folks who use spirituality, but it would be interesting to see if it was also, just broader, that people do look to chaplains for that role. But I appreciate the question about, do we have that positive bias? I think we need to look at that.
I think, in the wellness space, you need a toolkit. One thing is not right for everyone. And we have to attack this problem, this really complicated problem, with lots of different tools. And so for some people, they may prioritize a chaplain who they know is part of the patient care team as helping them in that moment. Other people may prioritize a therapist who they don't know, who is not, has never met the patient. Other people may prioritize a therapist who's not part of the system at all, right? Other people may prefer to talk to team members. And so I think we have to be, it's a holistic view of the problem. One thing is not going to be right for everyone, and that's okay.
The more we have that menu for people to choose from, the more we can promote this actually working. I just had in case this morning where an associate was having a hard time. They've tried a couple different resources that were not a good fit for them. And so the next one we're connecting them with, hopefully that one will work. But it's a give and take of, if we truly live into this model of everyone's unique, but everyone's worthy of the care that we need to care for them and engage them, and this holistic model is really important. We have to have all those options there to help each individual engage, so that we're building that as a cultural model, that it's normative, that you can seek help and resources from those places that are going to help connect most for you and authentically help you move forward. Through that grief, also recognizing that grief is not always a bad thing, but that we can engage it and we can sit with it.
Yeah, Adriana says in Ontario, after facilitating clinical debriefs, she also refers for EAP. Absolutely. Yeah, it's both and. Yeah, and I think that the EAP usage is, again, an organizational thing. We have upwards of 30% of our workforce has at least connected with our EAP. And then there's some attrition, but then those who go on to the next step, about 60% actually receive services. But we changed EAP program several years ago to get a more robust, more flexible, just a better program for our people on purpose. And we have on-site folks who work with our chaplains closely to do debriefs together sometimes. So again, it's like both and. How do we do this well, like as a team? And yeah, Ruth, we have a peer-to-peer support program. We have all the things. Coordinating all the things is like something we're thinking a lot about right now. So when there's a really hard day in the ER and the PICU, how do we ensure that the response is coordinated and comprehensive and reliable and rolls out in the same way every single time, so that everybody gets offered what they may need over time and not just once.
I like the question about the being utilized. I think that's another huge conversation. We could do an entire webinar on how to promote utilization of resources. But again, that's a place where chaplains do have the opportunity, when those things are available within the organization, to build that into the normative culture of, these are here, we're going to promote all of them and help really encourage people to reach out and use them. All of my chaplains have little cards that have a list of these resources that they can hand out. It has, ways to, it's just a QR code. This will get you to a website that is a clearinghouse of everything. You can hand that out. People still have to scan the QR code, but at least it gets them to a point where all of those things are clearly visible in a quick period of time. And again, that's a way to build it into the culture where you don't have to dig through 18 different pages to find the information on your internet. It's right there. It's easy to find. Does that fix utilization? No, but it is a factor. The easier we can make it, the better.
I think a lot of what we've been talking about really points to the idea that chaplains can't operate in silos. Like, we need to be a part of all these conversations. Like, there's not one organizational intervention that a chaplain does that I can point to. It's an organizational factor. It's an intervention that affects the organization, so it involves more of the organization. Just wanted to point that out. I think it's pretty clear we have to be collaborative.
The question about self-care and clinician new hire. Oh, I have so many thoughts. Like, I could do an hour just on that, right? Because I texted my friend Krista Gregory, who's a chaplain at Dell Children's, this morning to see if she was going to join this webinar, because she runs the Center for Resiliency at Dell Children's, and she came and did grand rounds here at the end of the summer, and she talks in her grand rounds about how she would choose a different word than resiliency now if she could, because resiliency has had such backlash. If all of these system factors are driving clinician burnout and low clinician well-being, why are we asking people to take care of themselves in a toxic environment? And so the early forms of our strategy and I sit in a quality space here too. So our key driver diagram for the system did not include personal care. And the bottom line is, even if we do all these things in the system, it's still going to be a stressful place to work. People still must take care of themselves as well. So again, it's both and I think boundarying ourselves, figuring out our own practices, which is a journey, it's a practice, it's not a destination for me in particular, has been really critical. And a lot of what I did early on, I wasn't even aware that I was doing it. Now I can kind of articulate this is my practice. But yeah, I think absolutely, especially at this point in time, given the past 10 years in America, everybody should be should be engaging in self-care practices, not just clinicians, but especially clinicians. We absolutely must, in addition to trying to fix the system.
Like these comments around being involved in orientation as a place to really build that culture. And yes, if you are able to get into a place where someone from spiritual care is involved somewhere in that, and I know that's an easier ask in some systems than others, but that can be a really good opportunity to set that tone for the culture of your organization. I have the luxury of doing that every week with all of our new hires. So 100% of them see my face, which is disappointing to many of them, I'm sure. But it does give them the opportunity to hear about spiritual care, about holistic wellness throughout our system. And I give that smorgasbord of options of things of, if spiritual care is not the person that you're going to go to first, here are the other 8 options that you have. And building that into just the normative culture of find the thing that works for you and use it. Coming into a new role is that opportunity for everyone. They're changing their routine, their rhythm in their commute, in their drive, in their whatever it is, you're learning new things. It's the opportunity to build that self-care in as a new resource, even if it's not something you've done, because you're building an entire new routine. So that's another great option. I appreciate that.
And I think one of the things that I've learned now that I sit on like the operational side is onboarding should not be a single point in time. It should be ongoing over 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. And so I think like that, yes, you do it at the beginning and you remind people at the 60-day mark or the 90-day mark to reinforce, because now that they've like adapted to the system, they may have forgotten everything that was coming at them that first day. So there are opportunities just to continue to reinforce that.
Another thing we're piloting here right now is getting a list of those new hires every month from our orientation people so that we can really target and engage checking in on them in that 30, 60, 90-day range. So that we build that culture in that you're getting someone who isn't your direct supervisor checking in on you. And so we're working with that with nursing education to have that balance of at least one of us is checking in and seeing how they're doing.
The other thing that I was thinking about as I was reading this paper is just how much good work chaplains have done in these spaces that may not have been published in a way that looked like the kind of study you were looking for. I think about my friend Edie Meyerson at Sloan Kettering, who does this thing called Bring It to the Table. I think about the work that Krista's done for the Center for Resiliency, and she's published a ton in self-compassion. So sometimes chaplains are doing work that might not show up in this kind of question. So I think that there's a lot of space for the work, the way the work is done, you know, that this, when you ask a research question, it has to be really narrow, and that's appropriate and that's necessary. And there's a lot of other stuff that's happening that may not have shown up in this kind of review.
There's another question here, how can chaplains contribute to organizational factors and other external elements in addition to personal factors? I think the place that I would say start is engaging with your local leadership. So the more that you can comment and contribute and connect with them is a way to understand what is the culture that's going on around you. And where are those strategic initiatives? What are things that are already being done and within the organization? And how can you tie into those? There's no way that a small chaplain department can reshape or reinvent the wheel for what's going on culturally within our organization. But there are ways that we can step onto that and really help what's already being done and maybe guide it in a little bit more caring, compassionate, thoughtful direction that builds this into the culture rather than just saying, well, we focus on the individuals and the company can do what the company wants. But the more we can engage with that, the better.
Yeah, one of the interesting learnings I've had over the past year too has been there's like this HR space who are not clinical, who really don't understand the role of chaplains or the way that things actually play out on the front lines of healthcare. And so the solutions they bring are HR solutions, their benefits packages, their EAP, their things like that. And then there's the way that, that the clinicians function, which is completely different. And we're like, who is HR? What are they doing? It's just like there's these silos. And so I've been working really hard to break down those silos and like bring everybody to the same conversation for the good of the organization. And I'm lucky to work with people who are open to that. So I think to go back to the original question, what do you do if you have a chief wellness officer who doesn't have the background? If you're leading a spiritual care team, go meet with them and say, hey, we're doing these things. How can we support you? Or if you don't have a chief wellness officer, figure out who in your organization runs the benefits packages and go talk to them and say, hey, we're doing this stuff too. How can I support you? And just start those conversations and relationships.
Yeah, friends, we're close to time. Any last words from Ben, Sarah, Rachel? So appreciate putting my hands up to this fire and knowing that it could keep going for a while. But any final thoughts before we sign off here? I know you have a lot of thoughts, and the chat has lit up. And yeah, thanks, Linda. I so appreciate your active chatting. You can definitely hear your voice, and we do want to hear your voice, friends. With Transforming Chaplaincy, we're trying to advance spiritual care through research. We do believe this evidence makes a difference, and what Ben and Sarah and Rachel have shared has brought that to the conversation, and you have too. Without your participation, this organization, these webinars don't further the work that we do, and ultimately benefit our coworkers that we share in our respective spaces. So thanks very much for all that you do and the care that you provide, of course, not only for patients in their inner circle, but for the people that you rub shoulders with when you're charting or in that ICU space or whatever. We hope to see you for a future webinar. Check our YouTube channel for this recording. Send it on to others. Yeah, thanks everybody, and look forward to seeing you next time. Be well.